For as long as militaries have had access to explosives, they've been trying to find ways to deliver them to the enemy. Throwing them works, although that tends to come with some pretty serious range and payload limitations. And so in the ground-based fires game, armies have generally settled on a couple of modes of mechanical assistance. For most militaries, mortars and cannon artillery still account for a majority of their indirect fire assets, and we've talked extensively about them in the past. But when it comes to stocking up on artillery that might be able to reach out deep into the operational depths or dump the maximum amount of high explosives in the shortest possible period of time, some armies instead turn to multiple rocket launchers, or MRLs. While the war in Ukraine has generated hot takes and speculation around the end of a range of systems, from the attack helicopter to the main battle tank, coverage of rocket artillery systems has generally gone in the other direction. And since 2022, some countries have basically been yelling, "Shut up and take my money," as MRL production lines book out years in advance. So with purchases booming, lessons being learned and new technologies being developed, today it's time to talk multiple rocket launchers, asking how they're used, how they're evolving, and how long it's likely to be until someone decides that giving a drone access to enough firepower to delete a grid square is a fantastic idea. To do that, I'll start by looking at the history around how rocket artillery systems and the doctrine around them has evolved across different countries, before looking at who some of the primary suppliers, the market leaders are in the rocket artillery market, and some observations around the usage of these kind of systems in Ukraine, both in terms of how the Russians have used them and also how the Ukrainians have. And then I'm going to try and bring all those inputs together to enable us to be a bit more forward-looking and ask some of those questions we've asked about other systems categories in the past. How are countries trying to invest in, develop and evolve these systems to make sure that they remain relevant on future battlefields? But before we get into it, quick word from a sponsor. And today that means welcoming back my long-term VPN of choice, Private Internet Access. For the digital world, it's been a long journey from the likes of data cassettes and dial-up modems to what we have today. The modern internet now definitely comes with some perks. The logistics of these weekly episodes might have been a little more difficult if we all had to pile into a lecture theatre, but it's also clear the digital world can have some rough edges, and protecting your privacy within it isn't always simple. One thing you might want to do to manage things then is layer different tools and practices together. Just like you still might want to camouflage a vehicle despite the fact that it has armoured protection, you might also want to combine smart online practices and strong passwords with something like a VPN. A VPN can allow you to reroute your internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, and also potentially shift how that activity is logged. That last point is significant because Private Internet Access has long stated that they have a no-logs policy that's been independently audited and court-tested, as well as having an open-source codebase and servers in more than 90 countries and 50 US states. Plus, Private Internet Access is advertised as being available cross-platform and compatible with a range of streaming services. And unlike some of those services, a single subscription here will enable you to protect an unlimited number of devices. So if you're interested in adding this particular tool to your toolkit, there'll be a link in the description that'll give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, protected by a 30-day money-back guarantee and covering an unlimited number of devices. And so with my thanks to Private Internet Access as always, let's talk rockets. Okay, so let's jump into the history, and there's going to be a bit more this episode than there has been in many others. Because compared to some of the other systems categories we've looked at, when it comes to rocket artillery, there's more disagreement between various countries over what the system is meant to do. And the why of that difference owes a lot to history. Some of the basic concepts behind rocket artillery are many centuries old. For example, after the invention of gunpowder, it didn't take the ancient Chinese particularly long to figure out that you could attach a rocket to something, like an arrow, in order to propel it. Nor the process, while visually very impressive and considerably easier on your back and arm muscles than using a war bow to throw your arrow like a pleb, was also about as accurate as your average Russian propaganda piece, giving rise to concepts like the one you can see illustrated on the right there, where the inaccuracy of a so-called fire arrow could be partially compensated for through the relatively simple mechanism of mounting lots and lots of them together and firing them in a large volley. In places like Korea, those often man-portable rocketry concepts evolved into something a bit closer to artillery. The device you can see on the right there is called a hwacha, and it was basically a multiple launching system for a bunch of rocket-propelled arrows. They would be used in a number of scenarios, including against Japanese invaders, to launch massed arrow volleys against often area targets. At this stage, though, we're still mostly talking about relatively light projectiles. Metre-long rocket-propelled arrows, yes, but not the kind of large, high-explosive projectiles we would come to associate with rocketry a little later. For that transition towards bigger and bigger bangs, there'd need to be other developments. In the late 18th century, some of the biggest users of military rockets were found in the Indian kingdom of Mysore. The ruler of the time, Tipu Sultan, the famous Tiger of Mysore, distributed copies of a military manual that basically called for, in modern terms, the addition of a rocket company to each Mysorean brigade. The British would accumulate a number of practical experiences being on the receiving end of those rockets, but the British Empire of the era being the British Empire of the era, whenever it had encountered a potentially valuable foreign resource, it wasn't long before that resource was on its way back to merry old England. Reportedly, several cases of rockets from Mysore were sent back to Britain, but then development would rapidly accelerate under such influential figures as Sir William Congreve. Sir William arguably combined many of the features you needed to be successful in a 19th century British military development and procurement program. He had a good conceptual idea, believing the role of the rockets should be to facilitate the firing of a great number of rounds as quickly as possible, bringing in ideas of massed fires that might be somewhat familiar to us today, stressed the importance of the simplicity of the launch system, and by extension, the mobility of the launchers when compared to things like cannon, and seems to have understood the potential for rocket artillery to provide scaled range and payload. He also had a shit ton of money and was very good friends with the right people, including the Prince Regent, the future King George IV. Oh, and his father, Lieutenant General Congreve, was the comptroller of the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, which I imagine might have helped a bit as well. One imagines that may have made the process of convincing the War Office to purchase the rockets and support continued development slightly easier. So-called Congreve rockets would be produced in all sorts of shapes, sizes and calibers, but the basic concept was a very simple stick-type launcher with a rocket mounted on it. You can see a painting of Sir William on the right there, apparently admiring the rocket's red glare as the rockets are fired in the background against the city of Copenhagen. One point of historical trivia you may want to file away at this point is that precisely because the launcher and ammunition were so simple and mobile when compared to, say, large smoothbore cannon, for example, despite the major inaccuracy of these rockets, they did see some adoption by units including the Royal Marines, who were presumably in the market for something that might pass as an artillery system, but which was suitable for amphibious light infantry use. At this stage, I'm going to jump forward to the 20th century, but it is interesting to note that by the early 19th, arguably some of the common features and thinking around rocket artillery systems was already coming into place. The Second World War was really the heyday for the massed use of ground-based rocket artillery systems, and here the Soviets were arguably the leading actors. The Soviets would produce a range of rocket artillery systems over the course of the war, but generally honed in on three primary calibers: 82, 132, and 300mm. One of the most common configurations was to take a rocket launching rack and mount it on the back of a truck. And to borrow a modern buzzword, sometimes associated with some more modern MRLs, this meant that to a great extent, some of these Soviet launch systems were almost platform agnostic. One nickname for a lot of these MRLs was Katyusha. But there was no such thing as a single definitive Katyusha design. The one on the top right there, for example, has the rack mounted on a Lend-Lease American truck. Others would use Soviet-designed trucks as the carrying vehicle, and all up, about 10,000 of all types were manufactured over the course of the war. The heavier 300mm BM-31 version that you can see on the bottom right there was available in smaller numbers and came later in the war, and had a masculine rather than female identity, sometimes being referred to as the Andreyusha. For the Soviets, rocket artillery was commonly used as a method to deliver massed fires against area targets over short intervals. Katyusha volleys might, for example, be used as part of a preparatory bombardment, or be used against areas of troop concentration and preparation prior to a suspected enemy attack. Because accuracy probably isn't a core requirement if you're basically just firing against a large area circled on a map, using enough rockets to potentially block out the sun. The Germans were also large-scale users of rocket artillery during the Second World War, but on a different scale and in a slightly different way. There was one German system that came relatively close to being a direct analogue of the Soviet BM-8s and BM-13s, the Katyushas, and that was the 8cm Raketenvielfachwerfer, which I think would directly translate to something like rocket multiple thrower or multiple rocket launcher. I've got an image of one of those on the top right. You should immediately see the similarity to the Soviet system, but this was largely a Waffen-SS project, and only about 300 of them are believed to have been manufactured over the course of the war. Much, much more common were the so-called Nebelwerfers, or smoke throwers, that, despite the name, were almost universally used to deliver high explosive rounds, not smoke. So I guess German literalism kind of dropped the ball on that one. With most of their systems, the Germans do things slightly differently to the Soviets. The most common launching system is a short barrel, not an open rail. Many rockets are spin-stabilised in an attempt to gain at least some semblance of accuracy, and the most common calibre, starting at 150mm, where you have about 5,000 launchers and 5 million rockets built over the course of the war, are, on average, a bit larger than your standard Soviet rocket. The Nebelwerfer was produced in a range of calibres, from 15cm up to 21, 28, 30 and 32 from memory. And while you do see significant similarities in methods of employment, because the basic strengths and weaknesses of rocket artillery are what they are, you do still see some divergence and difference in emphasis. For example, the Germans introduced this vehicle, the Wurfrahmen-40, in late 1940. Like Katyusha, this wasn't a single standardised type of vehicle, but in perhaps its most common configuration, it was 6 heavy 300mm high-explosive rockets, still in their loading crates, strapped to the side of a half-track. Not particularly accurate and very slow to reload, it was still very mobile and very hard-hitting, so it was used as a support weapon, often for mobile formations, sometimes in urban areas, and reportedly picked up the nickname Stuka zu Fuß, or Stuka on foot. And you can imagine that particularly in the latter stages of the war, where the Luftwaffe wasn't particularly taking the Army's calls for close air support anymore, having a ground-based system with the ability to rapidly unload about 370 kilograms of high explosive onto a target area might have been considered a pretty valuable capability. By contrast though, and here's where one of our first historical divergence points starts to emerge, compared to the Germans and the Soviets, the Allies didn't really lean into rocket artillery in quite the same way. Yes, everyone who's played War Thunder is probably familiar with the vehicle on the right there, the Sherman Calliope, which is basically a rocket rack mounted on the turret of a Sherman. But in the grand scheme of the overall conflict, that vehicle and vehicles like it were relatively rare in Allied service and often arrived relatively late in the piece. The Allies did make some pretty notable use of rocket artillery systems to support amphibious landings. The craft you see on the right there is the LCTR, or Landing Craft Tank Rocket, which is basically a modern arsenal ship concept, but done in the 1940s. You take a landing craft with a lot of open deck space, and you fill every available inch with rocket launch racks. You then sail your very simple, very cheap one-shot wonders close to a beach that you intend to land on, before letting rip and demonstrating that even though these ships only had one shot, it was a hell of a shot. The British would also make relatively extensive use of rockets in the anti-air role. The so-called Z batteries came with a variety of drawbacks and limitations, but Britain wasn't exactly in a position to be picky when it came to anti-aircraft weapons in the early 1940s. The Allies also made extensive use of rockets mounted on aircraft, but as I said, comparatively little investment in rockets that started on the ground and were fired against other things on the ground. The Brits came up with this thing, the so-called land mattress, but it arrived relatively late in the war and was used in comparatively small numbers compared to those German and Soviet systems. And so depending on how you look at it, by 1945, the Western Allies' rocket artillery capabilities probably hadn't even caught up to where the Soviets had been in 1941. They had, however, started to catch up. They'd developed new systems and new tactics, tested them in combat, and were getting closer to having arguably equivalent systems to most of the key Soviet ones. Then, after the end of World War II, we arguably see another historical split. In the early Cold War era, the Soviets almost immediately plough on with a new generation of conventional rocket artillery systems. Some are evolutionary, some are revolutionary, and some are absolute garbage. But for the most part, the Western militaries look at these systems that they just saw fit to develop and start utilising during the Second World War, and for the most part, from a development perspective, just kind of lose interest. Now, make no mistake, NATO militaries in the early and mid-Cold War era do invest very heavily in surface-to-surface missiles. They just tend to be focused on the weapon of mass destruction delivery role. The system you see on the right there is the American M31 Honest John. Introduced 1953, this is an unguided surface-to-surface rocket, total mass about 2.5 tonnes with a 25-kilometre range, that did have the ability to mount a conventional high-explosive warhead, but realistically was mostly there to deliver nuclear weapons, or nightmare-inducing alternative payloads like this one. It's a cluster munition loaded with nerve agent bomblets, because weapons designers during the Cold War asked can we a lot more often than they asked should we. So while there were systems for conventional surface-to-surface rocketry here, a lot of the development procurement dollars were being drawn in by the nuclear mission. The US had the Honest John, so the Army could nuke people, the Little John, so paratroopers could nuke people, and the Davy Crockett nuclear recoilless rifle, presumably so people, if not exceptionally careful, could nuke themselves. Now, in theory, that should mostly be a joke, and it should have been possible to use the weapon relatively safely, but I imagine most troops probably would have preferred their nuclear delivery systems to be capable of firing a little further than 1 to 2.5 miles, depending on the version. I'll also note for completeness that it wasn't just the surface-to-surface rocket inventory in the United States that got more of a WMD focus during the Cold War. The assumption often was that the future battlefield would probably be a nuclear battlefield, and so just about every arm tried to get in on the action. For example, this is an extract from a US Army budget document covering fiscal year 88 and 89, and as you can see, it includes 2 line items for which the total allocated funding is classified. One is a 155mm chemical shell for the artillery, intended to provide, quote, a modern safe binary chemical deterrent stockpile to replace less effective and increasingly environmentally hazardous unitary stockpile, end quote. And the second is a line item simply titled Nuclear Material, which, quote, includes funding for support material and the 155mm nuclear projectile. The end of the Cold War reportedly killed that program, but I think it gives a pretty good taste at the time. While a lot of effort was going into making sure that the US Army could nuke East Germany 1,000 times over before the first Air Force bomber went wheels up, the conventional rocket artillery force, the one that had started to be built up during the Second World War, began to atrophy. On the right there, you have an image of an American T-66 multiple rocket launcher. These were sent to Europe during the Second World War, used on a very small scale, sent to the Pacific, used, I believe, not at all, but the inventory would be sent to the Korean War, used extensively there, and then basically withdrawn from service afterwards. And in the post-Korea period, NATO development efforts in this area become relatively sparse. The US Marine Corps, constantly looking for lightweight fire support options, did experiment with this thing on the right here, the XM70E2, and this is a bit of a strange one. It's got the longer barrel to try and increase the accuracy, but in order to save weight, it only has one barrel despite being a multiple-shot system. This thing is actually a rocket artillery revolver, which rotates one rocket after the other into that barrel for launch. The idea was certainly different, but just because an idea is different doesn't necessarily mean it's a winner. And so the concept never really went beyond a couple of test units being made. There were small pockets of development activity in the broader US alliance network. Japan, for example, built 2 ground-based rocket artillery systems for conventional munitions, Type 67 and Type 75. You can see both on the right there. But in terms of scale, these weren't really globally significant systems. I believe the production number for Type 75s was somewhere between 60 and 70. West Germany also came up with a lightweight artillery rocket system in 110mm in the closing days of the 1960s, but none of the other major NATO militaries would adopt the design. Their doctrines, for the most part, had a place for mortars and cannon artillery, surface-to-surface nuclear delivery systems, air support, etc., but no clear niche for a conventional multiple rocket launcher. The Soviets, meanwhile, designed and built, and then designed and built some more. They came up with equivalent, unguided surface-to-surface nuclear delivery systems. The Frog missile, for example, was broadly analogous to the American Honest John, but amidst all the larger stuff, the primarily nuclear systems and the tactical ballistic missiles, Soviet conventional MRL development also pushed forward. And just as the Soviet Union ended the Second World War with 3 main MRL calibers, the Soviets would end the Cold War with 3 main MRL calibers, each of which will be relatively familiar to those of you who've been watching the war in Ukraine, along with the vehicles launching them. The distant descendant of the Katyusha of World War II is the BM-21 Grad, firing a 40-pack of 122mm unguided rockets. And while the specific role might vary based on the rocket being fired, this is primarily a tactical level system intended to deliver massed fire against an area target. The larger BM-27 Uragan uses 220mm projectiles, at the expense of being a larger vehicle that is harder to reload and support. Then the even bigger boy, the BM-30 Smerch, could deliver 12 300mm rockets, each capable of delivering anything from 25 anti-tank mines to hundreds of submunitions to a quarter-ton thermobaric warhead, against targets around 70 kilometres away in the original Soviet versions, and further with later Russian enhancements. And at the other, shorter end of the range spectrum, we also saw the Soviets and later the Russians come up with some concepts for using rocket artillery to solve other tactical problems. The TOS-1A, for example, is a short-range thermobaric multiple rocket launcher intended to provide a solution to dug-in infantry or urban warfare scenarios, or at least ones where Russian commanders are content with literal scorched earth being the solution to the problem. And while the Soviets were continuing their development efforts, other countries that shared a little bit of doctrinal DNA were doing likewise. The Czechs, for example, came out with their own 122mm system, the Vampire, which was broadly equivalent to BM-21. And notably, some of those former Warsaw Pact systems have subsequently had a bit of a change of heart and are now fighting in Ukraine against Russian forces. The People's Republic of China also came out with a range of systems, including some very simple ones, like the Type 63 you can see on the bottom right there. Meanwhile, over in Tito's Yugoslavia, they came up with a number of systems that looked kind of like Soviet ones, but non-alignment and Belgrade's relationship with Moscow being what it was, the similarities were sometimes only skin deep. The Soviets went with 122mm, so of course Yugoslavia went with the slightly bigger and completely incompatible 128. But here's the thing, as the years were rolling on and all these countries inside and out of the Warsaw Pact were developing and fielding these kinds of systems, some in the US military were starting to have a bit of a change of heart. They'd seen the Israeli experiences during the Yom Kippur War, and of course there was the continuous apprehension of perceived Soviet conventional military strength and things like counter-battery capabilities. And so pressure started to build to get the United States and more of NATO back into the MRL game. And in 1983, that was exactly what happened, with the introduction of the M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS. It was a tracked MRL platform, capable of firing 12 227mm rockets, or carrying 2 tactical ballistic missiles. And despite the long doctrinal and development hiatus, it arguably represented a system that was a step up on a lot of its Soviet and PACT equivalents at the time of its introduction. Now, yes, as the decades have gone on, some of M270's original features haven't exactly stood the test of time. For example, if you wanted to load new weapons data into your M270, you would insert your data cassette with a total memory of 4 megabytes into your program load unit, and then allow 22 to 25 minutes for that 4 megabytes to transfer. And if you're asking, hey Parun, does that literally work out to be something like a 3 kbps rate of transfer for a system that doesn't have to communicate over the internet? The answer is yes, it was. While there might be some Australian internet customers listening, wondering where they can get access to those lightning-fast transfer speeds, most of you would probably expect slightly more speed and responsiveness in cutting-edge military equipment. In other respects, however, the M270 was a bit of a game changer. In Soviet rocket artillery systems like the Grad, reloading is an incredibly painful procedure. To fully load the system, you're going to need to unbox 40 rockets and then manually load 40 launch tubes. The M270, however, and later HIMARS, dramatically transformed the reloading process by aggressively weaponizing one of the US's military superpowers, logistics. The rockets used by the system would be contained in roughly 4-metre-long launch pods, 6 227mm rockets to a pod, or a single TBM. The pods were full of quality-of-life features. They had stacking pins in 4 corners, so you could stack them 2 high during transport or 4 high during storage. They were designed to be safely handled by forklift, and when it came time to load them into the system, M270 came equipped with the hoists that allowed it to lift the pods up and into place. This made ammunition logistics easier, reloading considerably faster and less labour-intensive than in Soviet systems, and most importantly, it turned the launcher into a bloody omni-mech, because now you could change the calibre and role of the system by just swapping out the pods. In Soviet and later Russian equivalents, an M270 firing a 6-pack versus an M270 firing ATACMS would be 2 different vehicles. And if you're talking about mirroring everything the Koreans would later do with this pod concept, you might be talking about 3 or 4 vehicles. And I'd argue that in Ukraine, we've seen some evidence of just how effective this overall pod concept can be. Vehicles can rapidly shoot, scoot, relocate, and reload, without needing large numbers of attending loading vehicles and without needing to be stationary as long to enable a crew to undertake the reload. And if you want a tad more evidence that America might have been onto a bit of a winner with this weaponized shipping container thing, just spare a thought for a moment of how many other competitor systems have ultimately adopted the same or a similar concept. South Korea adopted it, Israel adopted it, some Chinese systems have adopted it, notably not Russia though. When they started to come out with their new Tornado G and Tornado S MRLs in the 2010s, they notably stuck with single caliber designs. Whether that was just to maintain continuity with the old BM21 and BM30, or because manually loading 40 launch tubes is considered character building or something, we'll probably never know for absolute sure. In any case, let's jump back to the MLRS. The M270's introduction also almost accomplished something very, very strange. It got a lot of NATO standardising on the same type of system and the same calibre, including the French and the Germans. Countries which adopted the M270 or their own domestic equivalents included Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, the United Kingdom, South Korea, Italy, Israel, Germany, France, Finland, Bahrain, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Greece and Egypt. And so after numerous failed joint aircraft and main battle tank development programs that ultimately didn't produce a universally acceptable design, in the end, NATO established a lot of commonality around the M270 platform, not because it had been a joint project, but because it was just that good. That unity is, of course, now breaking down, with countries in NATO adopting a range of next-generation systems, including the Korean Chunmoo, the Pulse from Israel, and the HIMARS from the United States. But for a good few years there, the standardisation wonks in Brussels could celebrate a solid win. So that gets us, I think, to the end of the Cold War and what we might call modern MRL offerings. So now I want to pivot to looking at how some of the primary actors out there regard the role of the MRL, what they expect these systems to be able to do, and what some of the general strengths and weaknesses of the system category are. If you were to pull together a sample list of some of the strengths and weaknesses of rocket artillery relative to other systems you might potentially use for various battlefield tasks, some of the features you might want to highlight go back to those very earliest history slides. All else being equal, it is usually going to be much easier, cheaper and lighter to build a rocket artillery system with a given number of tubes than it is to build an equivalent number of cannons in the same calibre. The Grad manages to fit 40 122mm tubes on the back of a relatively simple truck. Now think about how much luck you'd have repeating that exercise trying to fit 40 122mm guns on it. The M777 is described as a lightweight 155mm towed howitzer, but that single 155mm gun masses about as much as 2 MLRS pods packing 12 227mm missiles. Basically, because with rocket artillery, more of your investment and capability is in the ammunition, not the launcher, you're often going to be in a much better position to cut down mass on the launcher. They're also generally going to be capable of very high burst rates of fire and greater potential to make the systems multi-role. Cannon artillery may be able to load different ammunition, but it's not going to be able to pull the same party trick of changing calibers that you can with something like the pod system. However, these kind of systems also obviously come with drawbacks, which helps explain why a lot of militaries have used them to complement cannon artillery, not to replace it. Rockets are generally bulkier, more complex, and considerably more expensive than artillery rounds, and multiple rocket launchers can chew through them incredibly quickly. According to a US field manual, the M270 is meant to be capable of firing all 12 of its rockets over the space of 60 seconds. At $167,000 per Gimler's round in recent US budget documents, that would mean it would cost about $12 million to fire a battery of 6 M270s for 1 minute. If you keep those launchers firing once every hour, 8 hours a day, and of course give them the weekends off, those 6 vehicles are slinging about $500 million of ordnance every week. Over the course of a year, you could potentially spend an entire Canadian defence budget just keeping those 6 vehicle crews blazing away Monday through Friday. It also helps to put into perspective the kind of production rates and supplies to Ukraine that we've seen over the last couple of years. Producing 10 or 14,000 rockets a year might sound like a lot, until you realise Ukraine's launchers could probably chew through 10 times that if the ammunition was available. So how do you go about using a system with those kind of core characteristics? We'll come back to looking at the Russian utilisation a little bit later when we talk about the war in Ukraine. But let's start with the United States. If you want to start with how M270 was originally intended to be used, the following is a quote from Field Manual 6-60 back in the 90s, and it said the following. The multiple launch rocket system is a highly mobile, rapid-fire, surface-to-surface, free-flight rocket and guided missile system. It is designed to complement cannon artillery, to attack the enemy deep, and to strike at counterfire, air defence and high-payoff targets. It can supplement other fire support systems by engaging a dense array of mechanised targets during surge periods. The manual also describes the versatility of the system, saying it can do everything from providing close support to manoeuvre units, to engaging in counterfire, as well as potentially engaging operational targets, probably with ATACMS, at the direction of division, corps or the task force. And while you might imagine rocket artillery systems being fired from well behind the front lines or lined up en masse like a World War II newsreel, the actual utilisation concept for M270 was to use them in relatively small numbers fairly close to the front line. Quote, regardless of the tactical mission, MLRS units are positioned and fight well forward and use their shoot and scoot capability to improve survivability. Forward positioning is critical to accomplishing these deep missions. When providing close support in the offense, MLRS units move with the maneuver forces that they support, stop to fire as required, and then move rapidly to rejoin the formation. In the defence, these systems support maneuver units by moving laterally along the front line of owned troops, the FLOT. This allows MLRS units to take maximum advantage of their range to protect manoeuvre units from the destructive effect of enemy indirect fire systems. It was even established as doctrine that far from holding back, the MLRS may have to push far, far forward in order to get the maximum possible reach. Quote, to support deep operations, MLRS units are positioned close to the FLOT and in some cases beyond the FLOT to engage the enemy at maximum ranges and to continue to attack him throughout the depth of the battlefield. End quote. The continuing theme here is that this is a very dangerous, very lethal supporting system that can be used for a range of purposes that is meant to rely on its mobility for survival, not its range. There's also a note in the manual about the potential higher level significance of the system, which I think remains potentially relevant today. Quote, "The MLRS plays a critical role in contingency operations because it provides a massive infusion of combat power in small, rapidly deployable force packages. The extreme lethality of the MLRS family of munitions, coupled with the air deployability of the system on a variety of aircraft, makes MLRS units the logical choice to deep fires for initial entry forces," end quote. Basically, if you're told to get a force on a plane and get it deployed somewhere else in the world very quickly, and you would like it to go with some meaningful level of fire support, the sheer amount of very dangerous, very flexible bang that you can fit into a small number of relatively light rocket artillery vehicles might make them a comparatively attractive first response option. Russia probably didn't really notice when Ukraine received its first 4 or 8 M777 howitzers. They absolutely noticed when the first 4 to 8 HIMARS showed up. One thing M270 was not meant to be doing in the 1990s US conception was functioning as a direct close support system. The manual listed a range of factors as to why that was the case, some operational, like MLRS battalions usually lacking the relevant fire support coordination personnel, or that in most cases the M270 should probably be doing something else instead. Quote, "The use of MLRS in the decentralised direct support mode denies the force field artillery commander the use of an important asset needed to influence the battle," end quote. But some of the biggest issues really came down to the ammo, because you have to remember that in the 1990s, the standard original payload for M270 was the M26, an unguided cluster munition. In that sense, the early M270 rockets had a lot more in common with the Soviet and Russian systems than they did with the Gimler's rockets of today. These things weren't meant to be scalpels, they were meant to cause significant emotional events across entire grid squares. Quote, "Rockets are inherently less precise than cannon projectiles. They have a much larger circular error probable and are therefore much less predictable. Danger close for MLRS M26 rockets is 2 kilometres. In other words, this was a system you might be happy to fire in the general direction of potential intended targets, and preferably nowhere near your own troops. In the 21st century, though, we start to see another historical splitting point. The US would first develop more precision options for the M270 and later HIMARS, and then decide to go all in on them. The US and various NATO allies collectively divested themselves of hundreds of thousands of M26 and other similar rockets. Instead, they switched over to the new guided precision offerings, using a mixture of unitary high explosive warheads and the alternative effects warhead, which is the tungsten rain option. This procurement decision represented a massive shift in what future M270 and HIMARS units would be able to do. Gimler's gave the launchers the ability to fire very precisely at ranges more than twice as long as the original M26. However, that extra capability came at a price. The new rockets were much more expensive, and the overall inventories and production levels shrank. The vast majority of Russian artillery rocket production, however, appears to have remained unguided. Unguided attacks against area targets using unitary high explosive or cluster munitions generally appears to still be the default, while precision munitions, including precision munitions with cluster payloads, because these are Russian precision munitions we're talking about, are used for more specialised roles. As a result, I'd argue the Russian rocket artillery force looks much more like those Cold War or early 1990s concepts than the modern American force does. So in recent years, if you looked at the munitions offerings for some of the main MRLs out there, you might conclude there were different schools of thought when it came to what the MRL was meant to do. For the United States, M270 and HIMARS are precision-guided munition delivery systems first, with some wide area of effect options that are also precision-guided. For Russia, most of the rocket artillery inventory is still an area weapon first and a precision weapon second. Meanwhile, as we'll see a little bit later on, for some producers like the People's Republic of China or Republic of Korea that have really leaned into the potential of the pod system, MRLs are being designed and advertised as true multi-purpose systems, capable of doing everything from saturating battlefield targets with barrages of unguided rockets to lobbing anti-ship missiles hundreds of kilometres over the horizon. So while a lot of these systems may often look aesthetically similar, often the concepts or emphasis in how they're expected to be used can be quite different. And on that note, I think it's time to transition from primarily theory to some observations we can make about how we've seen Russia use rocket artillery systems in Ukraine. And here I want to start with primarily the smaller and unguided rockets, because I think there's evidence to suggest that the way Russia has been using these systems has almost followed a kind of inverted bell curve over time. Initially, when available rocket stocks were high and expectations of a long war were comparatively low, some Ukrainian sources suggest the Russians were very liberal in how they chose to hand out rocket barrages. At that stage of the war, even comparatively small Ukrainian concentrations or positions might have been sufficient to attract massed Russian rocket fire. That approach, however, appears to have been significantly scaled back over time, one imagines in significant part because of ammunition issues. Yes, Russia started the war with significant stockpiles of artillery shells and rockets, but when you're talking about an individual Grad being able to fire 40 rockets over the course of 20 seconds, there is no stockpile on planet Earth large enough to support all of the rocket launchers in the Russian military emptying their racks at anything that moved continuously for more than 2.5 years. Consequently, while you never see the Russians stop using rocket artillery, they continue to make quite extensive use of it. The rate of rocket consumption does appear to have shifted downwards. However, in 2023 and 2024, it's reported that Russia may actually have increased the emphasis it places on rocket artillery production and use, ironically enough, in part to offset shortages that were affecting the cannon artillery. To quote from a RUSI report, the production of multiple launch rocket systems started from a much lower base, but has increased at a faster rate. In 2023, Russian 122mm Grad production was just 33,000 rounds, but in 2024, production is on track to exceed 500,000 rounds. Similarly, 222mm Uragan rocket production was just 2,800 rounds in 2023, but is on track to reach 17,000 rounds in 2024, with a similar rate of increase anticipated in 2025. As to why Russia might be dedicating the resources to ramp up rocket production, as opposed to other munitions, including cannon artillery rounds, RUSI notes the following, quote, "This prioritisation of MLRS production is intended to compensate for a shortage of replacement barrels in 2025. And therein lies one niche advantage that rocket artillery systems do have over their cannon equivalents. While they tend to have some features, for the most part, the rocket launch tubes on something like the BM-21 are pretty much just tubes. Tubes that don't wear out particularly quickly and are simple enough to replace when they do. Cannon barrels, however, or at least cannon barrels that don't regularly explode, are a more specialised product. And while Russia has been able to partly solve its shell problem by securing ammunition from North Korea, it's not clear, once they run out of barrels to strip off systems currently in storage, what Russia's plan might be in the medium term to keep its guns firing. If this report is accurate, the increased use of rocket artillery may be at least one part of their planned solution. In a similar vein, we've seen Russian forces field all kinds of ersatz rocket artillery systems that have often involved relatively simple modifications, like taking a naval rocket launcher of some kind and welding or bolting it to the top of an MTLB. It's always possible that shortages of dedicated MRLs in some Russian units may have motivated these kind of solutions. But given the enormous number of Russian rocket artillery systems that were believed to be in storage at the time of the invasion, I think another part of the answer may just have been ammunition availability. Strapping naval rocket launchers to armoured vehicles may not be the ideal solution to ground-based tactical problems, but it does potentially allow you to access naval ammunition stores. And given the Russian Navy these days isn't really in the business of getting close enough to the Ukrainian coastline to use any of these systems, it might make sense on a limited scale to leverage those launchers and ammunition stockpiles in order to alleviate at least some shortages. We do also have visual and anecdotal evidence of Russia making use of guided rocket artillery projectiles in Ukraine, particularly with its heavier systems, although it's worth noting that the scale of their use and the relative importance they played looks very different on the Russian side than, for example, Gimler's does for the Ukrainians. At this stage, I don't think our dataset is extensive enough to enable us to make any definitive judgments over just how accurate these various Russian systems are. I've often seen it claimed that some of these guided Russian systems aren't as accurate as some of their Western equivalents, but my response to that would be either way, that in many cases these precision weapons are being used to deliver very much non-precision payloads. The 300mm 9M549 rocket, for example, has a range of about 120 kilometres and is a guided system with a couple of small flight control wings at the front of the rocket, but it basically serves as a guided bus for a bunch of high-explosive fragmentation submunitions that are going to blanket a relatively large area when they arrive. So if we want an explanation as to why Russian guided rockets may not have made as much of an impression on the battlefield as we may have expected pre-2022, we probably need to look for explanations beyond just disappointing levels of accuracy. ISR issues may be part of the answer, but another might just be limited inventory and production rates. On a number of occasions, the Ukrainians have recovered debris from guided Russian artillery rockets and, surprise, surprise, found them chock full of components that Russia isn't meant to have access to. That obviously doesn't mean Russian sanction busting and evasion efforts can't get their industry access to these components, or that production can't continue on some scale, but it may also be that in terms of production costs and uncertainty, sanctions can do a lot more damage to the efforts to produce a system like this one than a comparatively simple unguided rocket. And so if Russia is choosing where to deploy limited available resources and focus productive effort, these kind of systems may not be at the absolute top of the list. Moving on to loss patterns then. If we look at the visually confirmed loss data for Russian rocket artillery systems in Ukraine since 2022, there's one major statistical correlation that immediately stands out. As a general rule, if you're a Russian rocket artillery crew in Ukraine, the further your system can shoot, the less likely you are to get shot in turn. What you can see on screen here is a chart showing the visually confirmed losses of Russian rocket artillery systems in Ukraine, split up by their caliber/range bracket. Immediately you can see that losses are highest amongst the 122 and 220mm systems, with comparatively tiny numbers in the 300mm category. But given the BM-21s and other more modern 122mm systems, like certain versions of the Tornado are by far the most common MRLs in Russian service, we have to make a little bit of an adjustment here. What you're seeing now is a chart showing visually confirmed losses as a percentage of estimated pre-invasion inventory. For every system other than the TOS, these are the Military Balance 2021 estimates, and for the TOS-1A, it's the open source estimate of around 45 units. And what you can immediately see is that apparently carting around a rack of extremely explosive thermobaric rockets that only have a firing range of between 5 and 10 kilometres, depending on the version of the system, is apparently really bad for your health in Ukraine. At time of recording, the visually confirmed losses of TOS-1s in Ukraine amount to about 2/3 of the pre-war inventory, 30 out of 45. And while yes, some replacements may have been delivered over the course of the war, that also applies to the other systems on this list. Losses of 122 and 220mm systems are close to about 40% of the pre-invasion inventories, while for the much longer range 300mm systems, like Smerch and Tornado S, we have visual evidence of a grand total of 2 units being lost from February 2022 to November 2024. And while this anomaly could be driven partly by what losses do or don't get visually confirmed, in a scenario where it is entirely possible those larger Russian systems are firing on Ukrainian targets from beyond the range of HIMARS, Ukrainian FPVs or cannon artillery systems, this may also partly just be a case of range paying off. Okay, so if that's the Russian experience, what about the Ukrainians? In the past, we've talked about Ukrainian MRL tactics a lot more than Russian ones, so I won't dwell here for particularly long. But it's worth noting that, like Russia, Ukraine operates multiple different MRLs with very different battlefield roles. There are some Grads and Czech Vampires, for example, that can be used against regular area battlefield targets, but Ukraine's supply of these systems, and critically their supply of the ammunition for these systems, is much more constrained than their Russian opponent. Instead, a lot more public attention and focus gets placed on HIMARS and the less famous but still very effective M270s. And in a lot of cases, we've seen these systems used in a way that would probably make the authors of that 1990s field manual pretty proud. Namely, they've been highly mobile, responsive assets, capable of engaging both tactical and operational targets. The various versions of the Gimler's round have absolutely been the bread and butter, pushed into service against a wide variety of targets. We've seen Gimlers used as a counter-battery weapon against Russian artillery, against ammo depots, against headquarters, and when using the tungsten rain option, against troop and vehicle concentrations. I think it's also notable that some of the most commonly cited limitations for a Ukrainian HIMARS and M270 when using Gimler's rounds hasn't really been a shortage of launchers or their vulnerability, but rather the dual challenges of ammunition availability and Russian electronic warfare. The latter has reportedly often not been enough to stop Gimler's being useful, but has at times been able to degrade its accuracy, while the sheer demand for ammunition probably goes some way towards explaining why the US reportedly aims to increase production of Gimler's rockets from around 6,000 per year to 14,000 per year in 2025. Meanwhile, even though ATACMS TBMs are only believed to be made available in comparatively small numbers, we have visual evidence of them being used pretty effectively against a range of target types, with 2 particularly notable ones being helicopter bases and Russian surface-to-air missile batteries. It's worth noting that some of these strikes appear to have been executed with older cluster munition versions of ATACMS, including a few that may actually have been entirely immune to Russian GPS jamming because they were literally too old to feature GPS guidance systems. In February 2023, RUSI released a report which tried to explore why, over the course of 2022, Ukraine, using a relatively small number of Western-supplied multiple rocket launchers, may have been able to achieve such an apparently outsized effect with them when compared to Russia with its much larger MRL stockpile. The authors put forward a range of reasons for the potential mismatch. They noted the range and precision of the Gimler's rocket, which put the system beyond the range of frontline Russian tube artillery and enabled the system to move on roads parallel to the front line in response to identified targets, as well as, at that point, a gap between Ukrainian and Russian ISR capabilities. On the flip side, they suggested that Russia's own MRLs suffered from a number of comparative drawbacks, noting that while, quote, Russia possesses its own form of multiple rocket launchers that would theoretically be capable of reaching into the AFU's operational depths and conducting the same type of strikes, 3 elements stop this from happening: the ISR gap, the AFU's dispersion, and a lack of guidance kits. I'd note, though, that none of those advantages were static. and that we saw Russia make significant improvements to its ISR capabilities in 2023 and 2024, while also adjusting their own logistics to reduce the damage that HIMARS was capable of doing. None of those changes, however, appear to have driven a significant uptick in the number of Ukrainian HIMARS and M270s being lost. At time of recording, while Ukraine is believed to have lost about 80 MRLs of all types, of the approximately 68 HIMARS and M270s that Ukraine is believed to have received, we've only seen a grand total of 4 become visually confirmed losses. In other words, despite being pretty high up the Russian targeting priority list, long-range Western MRLs in Ukraine have proven to be pretty slippery targets. Unless, that is, you want to go with the Russian MOD figures, where HIMARS is the kind of system that has been hunted to extinction and beyond. I think we may have hit a 2024 record when, in a single day in late June, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that, quote, operational tactical aircraft, unmanned aerial systems, missile troops and artillery of the Russian group of forces destroyed 3 US-made HIMARS multiple rocket launchers, a transporter loader vehicle, and foreign personnel responsible for their use, end quote. Once again, though, the visually confirmed loss data seems to point towards HIMARS being relatively survivable in Ukraine, not a death trap that, apparently like the Ukrainian Air Force, is capable of operating rather effectively with very few or negative numbers of systems remaining. So the next question then is, where does that leave the rest of the world watching some of these experiences and observations come out of Ukraine? And here I think it's worth noting that on the global arms market, MRLs are one of those systems categories that is very heavily dominated by just a couple of key producers and designs. And so the development decisions made and competition between just a couple of key actors can have a massive impact on what we see in forces around the world over the next couple of decades. I won't go over absolutely all of them here, but I will look at a couple of the main actors. For a long period of time, and especially before the annexation of Crimea, Russia was a significant global supplier of rocket artillery systems. According to SIPRI's database of arms transfers, between 2008 and 2013, Russia made some significant deals to supply Azerbaijan with the Smerch and TOS-1, and Venezuela with just Smerch. 2014 to 21 would see more deals for the same systems, this time to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And pre-2022, it looked like some of Russia's next-generation rocket artillery systems, specifically the Tornado series, might be the next in line to achieve international sales success. Since 2022, however, the Russian defence industry appears to have had other pressing priorities besides export, and so we've seen other countries take the lead, both in terms of development efforts and also market success. For nations in the broader US alliance structure looking to rapidly rearm, we've generally seen an uneven competition, primarily between 3 key systems. HIMARS from the United States, the K-239 Chunmoo from the Republic of Korea, and to a lesser extent, the Precise and Universal Launching System, or PULSE, from Elbit Systems in Israel. If we look at just the last 5 years, some other countries' preferred suppliers have included India, Brazil, Turkey, and if you're looking for 122mm systems, the Czechs. Indonesia, for example, placed some significant orders for systems like the Czech Vampire and the Astros 2 from Brazil, while Bangladesh was a key customer for Turkey's T-300. Countries that may previously have purchased from Russia, meanwhile, may increasingly be pushed towards Chinese suppliers. Even though the PRC hasn't historically contested Russia or the United States at the top of the arms export table, it's always been a major player in rocket artillery. Over the past 15 years or so, China has signed export deals for more different types of MRLs than Israel, Russia, South Korea and the United States combined. And arguably some of the systems the PLA is now fielding don't really have direct Russian equivalents. One of the most internationally successful designs, for example, the SR-5, you can see one on the top right there, is a pod or canister type multi-caliber system with a wide array of munition offerings and a couple of familiar features. According to SIPRI data, China's share of international MRL orders has dropped off significantly in recent years, from a point where it, along with Russia, were the primary suppliers between 2008 and 2014, to one where, after 2022, Russia's sales have more or less collapsed, and the top 2 positions now belong to the Republic of Korea and United States. But China, along with the US, South Korea and Israel, absolutely remain major players in the rocket artillery market. But if those are some of the major players, I want to pivot now to discussing some recent development and procurement trends. Because while a lot of money internationally is being shifted towards MRL procurement, in many cases demands and expectations are shifting too. Trend 1 has probably been a focus to try and get access to as much missile firepower as possible, using vehicles that are preferably very light and very mobile. This is true both in a general sense, that we've seen a lot of forces choose to put priority and resources into modernising or expanding their rocket artillery inventories, as opposed to potentially choosing to focus on heavier, less mobile, ground-based fire options, but also in a sense that if you look at the dominant designs on the market, they generally prioritise keeping the weight down and the speed high. That means despite the massive initial success of the tracked M270 back in the late 20th century, in 2024 your options include a wheeled Korean system, a wheeled American system, or a wheeled Israeli system. Basically, when it comes to rocket artillery systems, a lot of NATO militaries appear to have embraced the traditional French hatred of tracks and love of wheels, except for the French, of course, who are still running their rocket artillery on tracks for the moment. We've also seen a lot of general market interest in a variety of light-wheeled missile platforms, which really channel that traditional advantage of keeping the launcher itself as simple and mobile as possible while putting the maximum possible focus on the missiles. A particularly extreme example here, and one we'll cover in more depth when we look at the US Marine Corps' Force Design 2030, is this thing here, the Rogue, which is what happens when a Marine is brave enough to ask the question, can you fit 2 full-sized anti-ship missiles on a stripped-down, unmanned joint light tactical vehicle? Nor is Rogue the only concept out there for cutting down weight and personnel count by using unmanned MRLs. Hanwha Aerospace in Korea has showed off the concept for an unmanned MRL, and the US Army has already test-fired this thing, the Autonomous Multi-Domain Launcher, which is basically robo-HIMARS. There are a couple of reasons that MRLs might be considered particularly good candidates for unmanned systems. Supervision and networking might be easier behind the lines. The navigation and environmental perception challenges are probably simpler than, say, a robo-tank or robo-IFV, for example, that might have to interpret and fight in a close-in urban environment. And at the risk of grossly oversimplifying, the core mission here can be comparatively simple. Basically, you need the system to be able to carry a box of missiles to a selected location and then point the box up. As to if and when we'll start to see unmanned rocket artillery systems start to be actually fielded in any significant numbers, only time will tell. Trend 2 has been that while a lot of militaries want their MRLs to be mobile, they also want them to be multifunctional. The US already did this to an extent with the M270 and HIMARS by providing both a tactical ballistic missile and a regular 227mm rocket, but some of the other designers out there have taken full advantage of the pod system to take this concept much further. If you look at the South Korean K239, it can feel a bit like there's a pod for every potential problem. If you want to provide massed affordable fires against area targets in the style of the BM-21, load it up with 40 130mm unguided rockets. Then in the mid-size range, you might have a mixture of guided unitary, guided cluster, unguided cluster, and then potentially various extended range options even before you start stepping into the 400mm and 600mm TBMs. Hanwha Aerospace has even indicated they might be providing an anti-ship ballistic missile option for K239, meaning for those of you counting along at home, a K239 with its full missile offering would be roughly capable of doing the jobs of a Russian 122mm system, 220mm system, 300mm system, anti-ship missile system, and the Iskander tactical ballistic missile launcher, all with the pod system that can be reloaded in minutes. And increasingly, the K239 approach is the rule, not the exception here. The Israeli system can be used to launch everything from 122mm Grad rockets to small UAVs and tactical ballistic missiles. And a number of recent Chinese designs have also adopted this multi-caliber pod approach and are increasingly marketed with a very diverse munitions offering. The potential advantages of doing that are significant, both in terms of increasing the flexibility of your own force and also making your opponent's decision-making a bit of a headache. By setting up your rocket artillery units to be able to fulfill all of these different battlefield roles and service this wide variety of targets by just swapping out the missiles, you may be able to provide your commanders more flexibility without scaling the overall force. And that potentially might also tax your opponent's decision-making. If they want to be able to get their ships closer to your coastline, for example, it may no longer be enough for them to knock out your dedicated anti-ship missile launcher units, because now every rocket artillery unit across your entire army is now potentially an anti-ship missile unit, as long as the missiles are allocated. Basically, flexibility for you might be risk and uncertainty for your opponent. Trend 3 has been a general push by many rocket artillery users to demand longer and longer ranged options. Something which makes a degree of sense given we just talked about the potential value of giving commanders greater flexibility to engage targets with the assets they have, and that based on what we've seen of the war in Ukraine so far, there may be a general survivability advantage to having the metaphorically longer stick. And here I'm not just talking about the big chunky TBMs that used to make up a lot of the longer ranged options, but also smaller tactical rockets. In the US, the production thumbs up has been given to the extended range version of the Gimler's rocket, which pushes its reach out to about 150 kilometres, meaning these 227mm missiles will have a maximum firing range pretty close to the Block 1A TACMs. The Koreans will obviously be offering extended range options for the K239, and in Europe we've seen the missile giant MBDA show off a concept for what appears to be a 227mm guided artillery rocket with a range of, you guessed it, about 150 kilometres. That's reportedly being developed in response to a French requirement. And then there's the People's Republic of China, where the motto may as well be go big to go long. The PHL-16, which you can see on screen there, can reportedly use a wide array of missiles, but in its 370mm configuration, the system reportedly has a range of about 220 kilometres. If you want that expressed in another arbitrary and completely random unit of measurement, it's about 1.2 Taiwan Straits. With development trends like this, it can sometimes be possible to lose the bigger picture amidst a tide of small incremental improvements. But if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, over the course of just a couple of decades, we've gone from having early model grads that can fire about 20 kilometres and M270s that have to ninja around near the front line to make the most of their M26s that can go about 32 clicks, to a world where you might have fairly common missiles that can go 80 or 150 kilometres, and the bigger stuff enables you to call in artillery from a neighbouring landmass. And you could argue that that increase in range and precision has occurred alongside an improvement in things like ISR capabilities and networking that make it much easier for forces to actually leverage that kind of range and precision. If the battlefield is increasingly transparent and networks increasingly capable, you can start to move towards a mode of operations where a force might be able to convert information from any sensor into a task for any shooter. And giving your rocket artillery more reach and more lethality might increase your odds of being able to turn information into a potentially very explosive battlefield outcome. It hasn't been a cheap process or one entirely without trade-offs, but it has significantly shifted how these systems can potentially be used. But in closing out that development observation, the constant push for more range, more precision and greater performance, I want to flag that based on the experience in Ukraine, there might be demand out there from some users for a development trend that goes in the other direction. Rockets that may actually sacrifice a bit of precision, for example, in exchange for a cost reduction and mass producibility. In Ukraine, we've often seen precision weapons be very effective, but at the same time, there's still been a massive role for things like unguided shells, massed fires, and weapons with wide areas of effect. If a country is looking to give its MRLs the ability to meet that kind of requirement, one option might be to use the pod system to swap in a bunch of unguided 122mm rockets, for example. But we've also seen some producers come up with designs to fill that kind of role, using missiles with similar calibers and form factors to their standard guided options. KDI, for example, has showcased concepts for both guided and unguided cluster rockets for systems like K239, with the unguided version cutting down on range and accuracy. The reported circular error probable is about 100 metres, in exchange presumably for a comparatively lower cost, and an approximate doubling of the number of submunitions carried. If your target is an area, not a point, some militaries might potentially see that as a more useful combination. In other cases, using 2024 technology, we might see producers trying to offer products that sit somewhere in the middle, not being completely unguided, but also not building all the features needed for pinpoint accuracy. For nations that are signed up to the Cluster Munition Convention, though, that probably means some sort of alternative wide area of effect warhead, like, for example, the US M30A1. While for the most part, efforts to develop and produce slightly less blingy missiles tend to represent the exception rather than the rule, against the backdrop of a general march towards greater and greater precision, some of the experiences we've seen coming out of Ukraine might cause countries to take a bit of a second look. If you believe you might be fighting on a future battlefield where your opponent has really good electronic warfare capabilities, for example, and as a result your precision guidance system may not deliver the accuracy that it normally would, you may want to have a stockpile of some simpler systems that are going to perform consistently in a high jamming environment. Alternatively, if you expect the opposing force might rely to some extent on hard-kill ground-based air defence systems to protect itself against your rocket artillery, the way Russia seems to, then you might increase your odds of saturating those defences or amplifying the shot exchange problem by mixing high and low spec missiles together. If you fire off a salvo of 6 missiles at an opposing target, and one has a CEP of 5 metres and the other's a CEP of 25 metres, that opposing air defence operator may not be in a position to assume they can reliably tell the difference between the two, and be forced to engage all of the incoming, bling or basics alike. It may also be that some producers see some defence economics reasons to embrace this kind of high-low ammunition mix. If you were to design a simpler, cheaper and less precise 227mm rocket, for example, it might provide you an opportunity to scale up common components, like rocket motors. Across the US defence industrial base, solid rocket motors have emerged as a pretty significant bottleneck across multiple systems categories. And when you're talking about a rocket artillery projectile, you're probably going to need exactly one rocket motor, whether you're talking about a blinged out precision missile or a near enough is good enough offering with some Cold War vibes. So if your goal is to generate as much scale as possible in rocket motor production within the bounds of a limited budget, being able to produce lots of cheaper rockets might be one way to do it. It may also mean that in the event of a wartime emergency or any other scenario where your supply chains suddenly can't keep up with demand, you might have a little extra flexible production capacity there, meaning you might be able to divert some production capacity for rocket motors, for example, or skilled labour and facilities from your less blingy system towards your more blingy one in order to help meet sudden surges in demand. Or, depending on the circumstances, you might have to go in the other direction, doubling down on production of your cheaper, simpler and more easily scaled system in order to make sure that your forces have access to at least something to fire, while you figure out the best approach to trying to keep the higher end stuff flowing as well. You're probably never going to have complete commonality or perfect transferability, but some countries might still see a broader rocket lineup as the optimal approach. The point here isn't that precision weapons are bad. They've proven incredibly effective in many conflicts, including in Ukraine. HIMARS haven't gone around eliminating command posts, ammunition depots, air defence systems and individual artillery pieces by blindly yeeting low-precision missiles over the horizon. It's also not the case that we should expect every military around the world to start stocking up on low or mid-precision options. Instead, what I'm trying to demonstrate, at least from a defence industrial perspective, is that one of the greatest strengths of the modern MRL is just how flexible it is. And because of the way these pod systems work, to an extent you could argue the available missiles really define the available missions. You can hypothetically have the same system capable of moonscaping a field 40 kilometres away and centre punching an air defence system 500 kilometres away. And so the more diversity nations choose to build into their compatible missile inventories, the more capabilities any potential opponent has to be prepared to deal with. And if the capabilities of the available missiles are one part of defining what MRLs are likely to be able to accomplish in current or future conflicts, another aspect that Ukraine has arguably highlighted all too clearly is the importance of magazine depth. Having access to hundreds of launchers or the most capable missiles in the world may not make the difference you expect if you don't have the industrial capacity and stockpiles to back them. MRLs may individually be some of the most dangerous vehicles that modern armies field, and new technological developments are likely to stretch their capabilities even further. But in the end, even the best multiple rocket launcher out there is only going to deliver results as long as you have rockets to launch. And okay, channel update to close out. Noting, of course, there wasn't one last week, so there are a few things to update on this one. Firstly, I'm fairly confident that just about everyone watching this episode is aware that earlier this week, there was a major event in the United States that's likely to have some pretty significant international implications, including for Ukraine. I put up a poll for the patrons asking whether I should engage with that topic this week or next, and they were pretty strongly in favour of just holding off a bit. Hence the decision to stick to the original release schedule and go with rocket artillery this week, with a look at the potential futures for Ukraine coming up next. Since this week has been a very eventful one, I'll be looking to catch up on a couple of other things next week, including some Patreon content and resuming the Perun gaming videos. Beyond that, I just want to extend my regular thanks to all of you. Thank you very much for your ongoing engagement with and support of the channel, and I very much hope to see you all again next week.